You know, usually when you open up an old administrative ledger, you expect dry, dusty numbers.
Yeah, just rows and columns.
Right. I mean, think about looking at an old corporate spreadsheet or reading through municipal tax records from a century ago. It is just binary, cold arithmetic.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
You have assets in one column, liabilities in another, and a list of dates.
Yeah. It is data meant for filing cabinets, not really the stuff of a thrilling conversation.
Because people record administrative data to keep track of inventory, not to tell a compelling story about survival.
But then you open up the book of Genesis, chapter 41, verses 46 through 49, and, well, at first glance, it looks like an ancient Egyptian spreadsheet. You see a man's age, an itinerary of his travels, some agricultural yield reports, and notes on storage logistics.
Right, it was like the minutes from a city council meeting on zoning and agriculture.
Yeah, it really does. So welcome to a new deep dive on Reformed thinking. Today, we are taking you right into the middle of those 4 highly specific verses. We are going to show you how this apparent administrative log is actually a staggering demonstration of divine providence, human stewardship, and eternal salvation.
And I am so glad we are doing this because the stakes here, they could not be higher. What we are looking at is the approaching shadow of a global famine.
A total cataclysm.
Yeah, a cataclysm that threatens to wipe out the known world at that time.
Yeah.
But more specifically and far more critically for the overarching story of the Bible, it threatens to extinguish the lineage of the promised Messiah.
Wow. Because the family of Jacob is entirely vulnerable.
Right. They are living over in Canaan, totally exposed to this coming drought. But before that catastrophic famine strikes the earth, God decrees a period of unparalleled supernatural abundance.
I want you to put yourself in Joseph's shoes for a second. Just try to imagine his specific minute-by-minute reality. We're talking about a man who just spent 13 years completely crushed by circumstance.
13 very long, very painful years.
Yeah. I mean, he was betrayed by his own brothers, thrown into a dry cistern to die, pulled out only to be sold as a slave to foreigners, marched across a desert and bought by an Egyptian official.
Just relentless suffering.
And then he gets hit with devastating, life-ruining false accusations from his master's wife. And he is confined to a suffocating, dark, underground dungeon for years.
Left to rot, essentially.
Exactly. Or, well, that is what everyone assumed. Then, quite literally, in the blink of an eye, he is pulled from that pit, shaved, given clean clothes, and elevated to the right hand of the most dominant ruler on the face of the earth.
It is such a rapid elevation, and it forces us to ask how the ancient Egyptian context shapes our understanding of this biblical text.
Right, because we need to grasp the sheer magnitude of what Joseph is actually managing.
Spot on. To do that, we have to set the historical stage in Middle Kingdom Egypt. This was the absolute, unrivaled superpower of the ancient Near East. Their civilization was a marvel of architectural triumph, bureaucratic organization, and military might.
They were the peak of human achievement at the time.
Oh, for sure. But their entire existence, their wealth, and their stability depended entirely on one single geographical feature.
The Nile River.
Yes, the Nile. Unlike the land of Canaan, where Jacob and his family lived, which relied on seasonal rainfall to water the crops, Egypt relied on the annual inundation of the Nile.
I think we really take for granted how unique that is. They did not look up at the sky for rain.
No, they did not.
They looked down at the river.
That is such a crucial distinction. They organized their entire calendar year around 3 distinct seasons based on the behavior of that river.
Okay, what were those seasons?
Well, first you had the season of Akhet, which was the time of inundation. This was when the floodwaters from the Ethiopian highlands swelled the river, covering the Egyptian agricultural lands and depositing highly fertile black silt.
So just massive flooding bringing fresh soil.
Right. And after the waters receded came this season of Peret, the time of growth and planting in that fresh mud. Finally, you had the season of Shimu, the harvest season. The entire economy, the religious calendar, and the survival of the populace rested on that cycle happening with mathematical precision.
So let's play out the catastrophic scenario here. If the rains fail up in the mountains far to the south, the Nile fails to flood.
The silt is not deposited.
Right. The ground just cracks in the blistering sun. A 7-year famine in that environment is not, a mild economic recession where people just tighten their belts and eat less meat.
No, not at all.
It is an existential threat. If the river stays low for 7 consecutive cycles, civilization itself faces total extinction. There is no backup plan.
And this historical reality brings us to the literary placement in the book of Genesis.
Oh.
We are reading the section known as the Toledot, or the generations of Jacob.
So this is focusing on the family line.
Yes. While the surrounding pagan nations are facing starvation and political collapse, the true overriding tension in the biblical narrative is the preservation of the messianic seed.
Right, going back to the Garden of Eden.
Yes, God made a promise in Eden that a descendant of the woman would crush the serpent's head. If this famine wipes out Jacob's family in the land of Canaan, then Judah dies.
And if Judah dies, the promised line of the tribe of Judah, the Messiah, never comes. The bloodline is severed.
The promise fails. That is what is at stake here.
Wow. I like to picture the narrative tension spanning Genesis chapters 37 through 40, like a person pulling back the string of a tightly wound mechanical spring.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, for 13 agonizing years, you watch Joseph's life get pulled further and further backward, away from the target of his childhood dreams. He starts as the favored son wearing the coat given by his father, and the spring gets pulled back as he is thrown into a pit.
The tension just keeps increasing.
Right. He becomes a slave in Potiphar's house. From a trusted slave, the spring is pulled to its absolute breaking point as he descends into a forgotten prisoner in a royal dungeon. You feel the potential energy of all that suffering building up. The reader is just waiting for the release. So, when Pharaoh has his dreams in chapter 41, is this the moment the spring finally releases?
It is the precise moment the tension breaks and the energy flies forward. And the way that release happens is fascinating, because it totally humbles the intellectual elite of the day.
Oh, the magicians and the wise men.
Right. Pharaoh has these terrifying, vivid dreams of the gaunt cows eating the fat cows and the thin, blighted ears of grain swallowing the healthy ears. He wakes up very troubled and immediately summons all the secular wise men, the court advisors, and the magicians of Egypt.
The smartest guys in the room.
The absolute apex of human wisdom in the ancient world. But they are completely baffled. Their worldly philosophy and their esoteric mysticism fail utterly in the face of a genuine crisis.
I mean, they had all the funding, all the education, and all the prestige, but they could not see the future.
That is the point Moses is making to the reader. Human wisdom has no answer when God decrees a global judgment.
Only God knows.
God alone declares the end from the beginning. He grants the infallible interpretation of the dreams exclusively to Joseph, completely bypassing the Egyptian elite. God reveals that 7 years of unprecedented plenty are coming, followed immediately by 7 years of famine so severe it will consume the land and erase the memory of the good years.
And the incredible thing is that Joseph does not just interpret the dream, collect a reward, and go back to Canaan.
No, he does not.
He gives Pharaoh an unsolicited administrative plan on how to survive the crisis, and Pharaoh immediately places him in charge of the whole operation. He is commissioned to save the world.
Which is just staggering.
It is. And this brings us right into verse 46, where we get a very specific, easily overlooked detail about his age. The text tells us Joseph is 30 years old when he stands before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Why include his age? It feels like random trivia at first glance.
Well, that age marker is heavily loaded with cultural and redemptive historical significance. In the ancient Near East, turning 30 was the recognized age of full physical and mental maturity.
So he is finally considered a full adult in their eyes.
Yes. And later, under divine law for the Israelites in the book of Numbers, 30 was established as the required starting age for priests to enter into the tabernacle duties and bear the heavy burdens of the sanctuary. It marks the transition into full, undeniable public authority.
So God was not just passing time while Joseph was in the dungeon.
There's a second.
He was waiting for the precise moment of maturity.
God used those 13 agonizing years to refine Joseph's faith in the furnace of affliction. Think about it. When Joseph was 17, he was boasting about his dreams to his brothers. He was naive.
Very naive.
If God had placed an arrogant, untested 17-year-old in charge of the global food supply, the pride would have destroyed him. The Lord was meticulously crushing any remaining pride, burning away his self-reliance, so that Joseph could bear the immense weight of global governance without falling into idolatry. The timing was flawless, down to the day.
The posture he takes is also striking. Moses writes that Joseph stood before Pharaoh. I know you've looked into the original language here. What does that phrase actually convey?
Looking at the Hebrew text, Moses uses the word amad, which translates to stood before. We need to ask why Moses chose this specific verb instead of halak, which means to walk, or yashav, which means to sit.
What is the difference?
The word amad denotes a formal state of readiness, an official commissioning, and heavy judicial weight. In the wider biblical theology of the Pentateuch, this is the exact posture of priests standing before the Lord to minister on behalf of the people.
So he's not just loitering in the throne room, he's taking an official stance.
He is functioning in a mediatorial role. He is standing in the gap, interceding through his administration for the survival of the nations. He takes this posture before the king, receives his absolute authority, and then immediately goes out for the presence of Pharaoh to execute the plan.
I want you to think about the times you feel completely sidelined. Maybe you are stuck in a job that feels like a dead end, or you are in a season of waiting that seems to drag on for years. The modern mindset demands instant platforms, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Everyone wants to skip the hard part.
Right. People want leadership roles, influence, and authority immediately without going through any kind of suffering or obscurity. But this passage confronts that demand for instant recognition, doesn't it? It shows us that true preparation for massive responsibility usually happens in places where nobody is watching.
The assumption that you can bypass the furnace of affliction and step right into a position of authority is a tragic misunderstanding of how God prepares his people. The absolute isolation of the dungeon was the necessary, unavoidable classroom for Joseph.
The dungeon was the classroom. I love that.
The character required to manage the wealth of an empire cannot be learned in a weekend seminar. It is forged through suffering. And notice what happens once his character is proven and he is officially commissioned. His authority translates immediately into exhaustive, highly organized action across the whole nation.
He does not just sit on a throne.
No, he moves from the microscopic center of authority, standing right before Pharaoh, out into the macroscopic sphere of all Egypt.
We see the geographical progression clearly in the text. Verse 46 concludes by saying, Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. He starts touring the provinces, inspecting the fields, assessing the infrastructure.
He's getting to work.
Right. Then we read verse 47. The text states that during the 7 plenteous years, the earth brought forth by handfuls. That is a curious translation. The Hebrew word there is likbatzim. What does that practically look like in an agricultural society?
Well, the word liquidsim suggests that a single stalk of grain was producing massive handful-sized yields.
Like literally the size of your hand?
Yes. Imagine walking into a wheat field, and instead of seeing normal-sized heads of grain, every single stalk is bending over under the weight of a cluster of grain so large it fills your entire hand.
That is just wild to picture.
It is an unnatural, explosive hyper-fertility. It goes far beyond a good harvest due to favorable weather conditions. This is an overabundance decreed directly by the creator of the soil.
It is almost like creation is stretching its limits to obey the voice of God.
It is a direct refutation of secular worldviews that attribute prosperity solely to blind economic forces or random climatic cycles. The earth obeyed the decree of God. The soil yielded an impossible volume of food because the Lord commanded it to do so.
But then it shifts, right?
Exactly. The narrative quickly moves from divine decree to intense human stewardship. God provided the supernatural abundance, but the grain did not harvest itself, and it did not walk into the storage silos on its own.
Joseph had to manage it. The logistics of that management are staggering to consider. Try to visualize moving millions of tons of grain without combustion engines, without trains, without automated conveyor belts. In verse 48, we see 2 dominant verbs used to describe Joseph's actions.
Kabatz and sabar.
Right. Kabatz, meaning gathered, and sabar, meaning stored up. How did this massive operation actually function on the ground?
Well, those verbs are incredibly revealing about his administrative genius. Kabatz implies a systematic assembling of resources from many dispersed locations. It is not haphazard, chaotic collecting.
It is calculated.
Very calculated. It is highly organized, requiring an army of overseers, scribes, and laborers. Then sabar indicates heaping up those resources into massive mounds or stockpiles. And the text gives us a brilliant logistical detail. It specifically notes that Joseph stored the food of the field in the cities immediately surrounding those fields.
Oh, so he utilized localized, decentralized storage.
Right.
That is highly optimized supply chain logistics, thousands of years before modern industrial engineering. Think about it. The natural instinct for a centralized government is to hoard all the wealth in the capital.
Oh, for sure. The pharaohs would normally want all the grain brought to Memphis or Thebes to consolidate their control and keep an eye on the resources.
But if you centralize everything in a country as long and narrow as Egypt, you create massive transportation bottlenecks when the crisis hits.
You would have thousands of boats trying to navigate the Nile simultaneously to get food out to the starving provinces.
Right. People in the outer villages would starve to death while waiting for grain shipments to be processed and sent back down the river. By storing the grain locally in the cities adjacent to the fields where it was grown, the distribution network is already in place the moment the famine strikes.
The food is already where the hungry people live.
It is brilliant. But looking at all this intense, sweaty, gritty administration raises a huge theological question.
Which is,
Does this practical human effort conflict with divine sovereignty? I mean, if God explicitly decreed the abundance and promised the survival of the nation, why does Joseph have to work so systematically? Couldn't he just relax?
that perceived tension brings us to a core theological rule.
Okay.
The God who ordains the end also ordains the means.
That's huge.
It is. Joseph's diligent, exhausting daily labor does not contradict divine providence.
Right.
It is the ordained instrument of it. Belief in a sovereign God mobilizes action rather than causing passivity.
That is a very countercultural point. A lot of people assume that trusting God means doing nothing.
If Joseph had taken the fatalistic approach and said, God promised to save us, so I'm going to sit back in my palace and watch him work, millions of people would have died of starvation.
Because he ignored the means.
Right. True faith in God's revelation always produces disciplined obedience. Joseph acted prudently, tirelessly, and brilliantly precisely because he believed the word of the Lord. His theology of a sovereign God drove him to become the most competent administrator in human history.
And his meticulous supply chain eventually runs into a massive problem, which we see in the climax of the passage in verse 49.
A good problem to have, though.
Yeah, a great problem. The sheer volume of the harvest completely breaks the Egyptian accounting systems. The text says Joseph gathered grain as the sand of the sea so much that he stopped numbering it because it was without number.
The Hebrew phrase is in misbar.
Why is the failure of their accounting system such a significant detail here?
To appreciate the humor and the theology of this detail, we have to look at extra-biblical Egyptian historical records. The entire Egyptian bureaucracy was built on a fanatical obsession with record-keeping. The scribes were a privileged class.
They wrote everything down.
Everything. If you read the propaganda of the pharaohs carved into their monuments, they constantly boasted about their ability to measure, tax, and stockpile wealth. They would record laying up grain in millions of measures.
Just massive exaggeration.
Right. Their hieroglyphic numbering system was designed to quantify everything, to project an image of total, godlike control over the natural world.
They wanted to prove they had a handle on the universe. Like they could count every single stalk of wheat.
By writing that Joseph had to stop numbering the grain, Moses is completely subverting and mocking that Egyptian propaganda. The highly sophisticated mathematics of Egypt's top accountants totally failed when confronted with the overflowing provision of Yahweh.
The blessing of God literally broke their spreadsheets.
Exactly. I mean, their abacuses ran out of beads. They simply had to put their reed pens down, admit defeat, and stop counting. God's provision exceeded human calculation.
That leads to a massive theological connection that ties the whole book of Genesis together. The text uses the phrase sand of the sea, or tal hayam in Hebrew, to describe the volume of the grain.
That phrase is not a casual piece of poetic exaggeration thrown in for dramatic effect, you know. It is a direct, redemptive historical echo of Genesis chapter 22, verse 17.
What happens in that chapter?
In that passage, after Abraham demonstrates his willingness to sacrifice Isaac, God makes a sweeping covenant promise to him, swearing by his own name that his seed would multiply like the stars of heaven and the sand on the seashore. Moses is utilizing that exact covenantal language here in Genesis 41 regarding the grain.
I want to make sure the weight of that connection lands for you listening. Think about the beauty of how God writes history. The text is subtly showing us that the physical grain used to save Abraham's descendants from starving to death is described using the very same language as the covenant promise made to Abraham decades earlier.
The provision matches the promise perfectly.
It really does. God promised descendants as numerous as the sand, and he provides grain as plentiful as the sand to keep them alive.
It brilliantly connects the historical reality of the Egyptian agricultural harvest to the eternal, unchanging decree of God regarding his chosen people. The physical grain preserves the physical lives of the family of Jacob, through whom the spiritual salvation of the world will eventually arrive.
Thinking about Moses writing these words brings up a question about the original audience. Who is Moses actually writing this down for?
That is a great question.
He was not writing this for theologians sitting in modern libraries. He was writing this to the Israelites who were currently wandering in the Sinai wilderness.
We have to consider their psychological and physical state when they first heard these words read aloud. These are the Israelites who had recently escaped hundreds of years of brutal Egyptian slavery.
And now they are in the desert.
Right. Now they are wandering in a barren, hostile, scorching desert environment. They're constantly terrified of starvation and dehydration.
Complaining constantly.
Oh, murmuring against Moses, complaining bitterly, and wishing they could return to the fleshpots of Egypt where they at least had a steady supply of food. They are gripped by a terrifying historical amnesia, forgetting the God who split the Red Sea.
So Moses is writing this historical record of Joseph to cure that amnesia and confront their present unbelief. The theological argument he is making to the wilderness generation is brilliant.
How do you mean?
He is essentially telling them, look back at your own history. The God who fed the entire known world during a 7-year global famine through the hands of one man in Egypt can easily feed 2 million of you with manna out here in this wilderness.
He is not constrained by geography.
Right.
Furthermore, Moses is writing a devastating polemic against the idolatry they had absorbed in Egypt. The Israelites had just come from a culture that literally worshipped the Nile River, personified as the god Happy.
They worshipped the river itself.
Yes, and they worshipped the earth itself, personified as the god Geb, as the ultimate sources of fertility and life. Genesis 41 declares absolute holy war on those false deities.
It proves that it was not the Nile's innate capability.
No, or the earth's natural biological rhythms that produce the life-saving harvest. It was Yahweh's spoken word. Yahweh commands the resources of the pagan nations to accomplish his will.
Reflect on your own tendencies for a moment. How often do you trust natural forces or your employer or your retirement account over the creator who sustains your life?
It is easy to do.
It is. When the economy is strong and your bank account is full, the natural human tendency is to attribute our security to our own cleverness, our hard work, or overall market stability. How does knowing God's absolute granular control over natural resources change how a person handles their daily anxieties?
Grasping this doctrine utterly shatters the fear of deprivation. When you recognize that God commands the yield of the earth, the rain clouds, and the economic systems of the nations to preserve his people, it produces a deep, abiding peace.
So you do not panic.
Right. You begin to trust God for your daily provision rather than hoarding resources in a state of frantic panic. Think about the Israelites in the wilderness. They tried to hoard the manna overnight out of fear that God would not provide the next day.
And it bred worms and rotted.
Yes, true reliance on providence frees you from the tyranny of anxiety because you know the supplier cannot run out of supplies.
And Joseph's salvation of the physical world in Egypt points directly to an even greater eternal salvation. We cannot read this passage about a rejected son rising to save the world without looking at Joseph as one of the most comprehensive biblical types of Christ.
Oh, the historical parallels between the life of Joseph and the life of Jesus Christ are striking.
Yeah.
And they are undeniably designed by divine providence.
Let's run through some of those parallels.
Consider the trajectory of both figures. Both Joseph and Jesus were greatly loved by their fathers.
Both were hated, rejected, and betrayed by their brothers.
Both were sold for the price of a slave, specifically pieces of silver.
Both were stripped of their garments by their tormentors.
Both descended into the pit of suffering, and both were falsely condemned by the surrounding culture.
Yet both were gloriously exalted from the depths to the highest place of honor.
Joseph, at the age of 30, begins his public life-saving administration in Egypt. Jesus, at the age of 30, begins his public ministry in Judea to save the world from sin.
Depending on what theological lens you are looking through, people see this set up in a couple of radically different ways when it comes to future events.
Right. There are two distinct theological fulfillments commonly discussed regarding this typology in our source material. First, you have the covenantal view.
What does that highlight?
This perspective highlights the spiritual reality that Joseph stores physical bread to save physical bodies from starvation. But Jesus actually is the bread of life.
He provides the grace.
Yes, providing an inexhaustible supply of grace to save eternal souls from the wrath of God. Just as the starving world had to come to Joseph and bow the knee to receive grain, the spiritually starving world must come to Christ and bow the knee to receive salvation.
Okay, what is the second view?
Second, you have the dispensational view. The sources point out a pattern where Joseph is exalted to authority before the 7 years of severe famine begin, and during that time of plenty, he takes a Gentile bride named Asenath.
So some theologians view this as a type of the pre-tribulation rapture.
Right, suggesting the church age, the gathering of a Gentile bride to the Jewish Messiah, occurs before a literal 7-year tribulation strikes the earth, mirroring the 7 years of famine.
I think the central truth remains rock solid no matter how you map out the future timeline. We are looking at a rejected slave who is exalted to the right hand of the supreme ruler to distribute life-saving grace to a dying world. That is the core reality that anchors our faith.
If we pull this historical narrative into our current reality, the text moves us from observation to practical daily response. We have to apply the principles of this text to modern mindsets, directly confronting several popular theological errors prevalent today.
Okay, let's hit them. First one.
First, this passage stands as a massive roadblock against the prosperity gospel.
Because Joseph had so much wealth.
Yes, but Joseph's season of unprecedented plenty was not designed for lavish personal consumption, buying bigger chariots, or living a life of absolute luxury. The abundance demanded agonizing, daily labor to prepare for an approaching crisis. Abundance was a mandate for intense work and preparation, not an excuse for indulgence.
That flies in the face of the idea that financial blessing is just a reward for your personal enjoyment. And there is also a clear stance against continuationism woven through this narrative, isn't there?
Yes, the source material we're analyzing takes a firm cessationist stance on this issue.
Because of the dreams.
Right. The prophetic dreams given to Pharaoh and infallibly interpreted by Joseph were for a specific, unrepeatable historical epoch. This occurred centuries before the canon of Scripture was written and complete.
So God used dreams then?
He used dreams to reveal his will and warn of coming judgment then, but today we look exclusively to the written closed canon of the Word for truth. We do not need new revelations from modern dreamers. We need to obey the sufficient authoritative revelation we have already been given in the Bible.
And finally, this text pushes back heavily against the idea of Arminian self-sufficiency, the belief that humans are the ultimate captains of their own fate.
The illusion that humans control their own destiny shatters the moment the famine strikes. The Egyptians thought they were invincible right up until the river stopped flowing.
Everything was fine until it wasn't.
Right. Whether that famine in our lives is a severe illness, a sudden devastating job loss, or the tragic bereavement of a loved one, our supposed free will and self-sufficiency evaporate instantly.
Where does true peace come from then?
True peace only comes from submitting to God's absolute sovereignty, recognizing that he governs all creatures' actions and things, from the greatest empires to the smallest drops of rain.
I want you to evaluate your own years of plenty right now. That plenty might be financial stability in your household, it might be the religious freedom you currently enjoy to attend church and own a Bible, or it might be your access to sound, rigorous biblical teaching through books and audio teaching.
We live in a time of incredible access to truth.
We do. Think of this season like a summer harvest. Are you actively storing up solid systematic theology, committing scripture to memory, and building biblical literacy right now while the sun is shining? Or are you squandering the summer on trivial entertainment and endless scrolling?
This raises an urgent point regarding stewardship. Abundance is a strict stewardship from God. Christians are obligated to organize their lives, their homes, and their finances to honor the Lord who gave them those resources.
Just like Joseph organized the grain.
Yes, we must act with the same diligence, the same meticulous, exhausting care that Joseph used to organize the storage cities of Egypt. You do not own the abundance. You manage it for the king. And he will ask for an accounting of what you did with the years of plenty.
Let's pull all these threads together. Genesis 41, verses 46 through 49, demonstrates that history is not a series of random collisions or blind chance. It is the precise, intentional unfolding of divine providence through faithful, grueling human stewardship. Every single element, from the terrifying dreams, the sudden promotion from the dungeon, the geography of the Nile, to the agricultural logistics, points us directly to the Savior who preserves his people against all odds.
I want to leave you with a final, unsettling consideration that we haven't discussed yet regarding the psychology of a crisis.
What is that?
Imagine what happens to the collective psyche of a society when the famine finally hits. They realize they spent their 7 years of plenty consuming everything, throwing parties, and assuming the abundance would never end, while a small minority diligently prepared.
That is a terrifying realization.
It forces us to ask what unseen provisions God is currently storing up for our future through our present trials. More urgently, it forces you to ask whether your own spiritual storehouses of faith will be full or completely empty when your personal inevitable famine arrives.
We started by talking about a dusty binary spreadsheet, assets and liabilities. Genesis 41 looks like an accounting ledger on the surface, but underneath the numbers and the city names, it is the blueprint of a sovereign God orchestrating the survival of the world. The columns of that spreadsheet are filled with the grace of a Savior who provides beyond human measure. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep your storehouses full, and we'll see you next time.